James Gillum, this Elizabeth Harris, whom I mentioned, her father married Martha Gillum. And Martha Gillum's father was James Gillum, Jr., and he fought in the Revolution from Virginia. And he finally came over this way, and I understand he's buried up near Lebanon. I've never been to his grave, but I think that's where he may be. Your daddy has some DAR lines in his family. I'm certain if I could ever get over to North Carolina and document and tie up some of these things. But I've never, since I learned how to do this, had time to get over and do the documentation on some of it. And I don't know whether I can read microfilm now or not. I seriously doubt it. Anyway, generally speaking, you all come from pretty good stock as far as I can tell. As you know, your daddy's grandfather came from Scotland to Baltimore and joined the Union Army, and having survived that, wound up as a rather elderly gentleman in North Carolina, over at Mount Pleasant, North Carolina, in fact, running a leather shop, because his father had been in the leather goods business, making boots and saddles and stuff like that, which probably was an excellent business back when everybody rode a horse. Everyone needed boots and saddles. And anyway, the son came, one son was a sea captain, and he was washed overboard, supposedly with a monkey on his shoulder. But before this disaster befell, he had persuaded two other brothers to come over and settle in the United States. So your father's grandfather was one of the brothers, and he did. As far as I know, he's the only one of the brothers who fought in any of the armies during the war between the states. He married a girl whose father had fought in the Confederate Army and had been killed at Petersburg when the crater blew up. And I can't remember whether... I know we took John there. I don't know about Roger and Susan when we went to Washington. I think the time we went back when just John went, when you all were in college or something, he was in his teens, we did go and look at the crater and saw the dent in the ground where Grandpa's shoe blew up. Now, the poor man who blew up was of German extraction. In fact, now I've gotten some research on his line, which is in my box, and it was either his father or his great-grandfather. I guess it was his grandfather, great-grandfather, I believe it was his grandfather, who was referred to as Henry the German in the early 1800s. So I gather Henry the German came from Germany. And that's a line you all can look into more if you want to. It may be very interesting. I don't know where he came from in Germany. We have one set of folks who came from Germany, the Riesenovers. I mentioned Grandpa Flanagan married a Riesenova, great-grandpa Flanagan. And her family came from the Palatine district. They were draft dodgers, as a matter of fact, to escape the German army, admittedly so. That's what they left for, to get out of the German army in the 1600s. And they wound up in North Carolina and in due course moseyed along and got over to the Pulaski area where John Reasenover died, leaving this daughter Polly. I found in the in the Pulaski courthouse, the new one, the one built after the Yankees burned the old one, where all the old good records are, some sort of document, I've forgotten whether it was a bill of sale or what, where Jacob Reasenover, that was Polly's brother, had sold his fence posts. So he was still around the county for a while. The line I really, really wish you all would look into if you ever get a chance and see if you can document some of this stuff is one you've heard me talk about a lot because it fascinates me, and that's the John Haggard line. I know who John Haggard's father was, but I can't straighten out who he married or how in the world he got to Tennessee. He and his wife were the unfortunate two killed by Indians. You've heard about this, and I've documented a lot of the stuff I heard told to me when I was a little girl. I have since documented in the Tennessee State Archives, but I don't know who the man married. Anyway, John Haggard and a brother were in the Nashville area in the 1790s and along there. Well, it was before that, 1780s, because I believe he was killed in 1791. And they were, John at least, was what was known as an Indian spy. Now that was later, I guess, what you called an Indian scout in the West. And there's a contemporary account in the history room in Nashville in the archives, some man, Putnam, I think, talking about the Indian spies, and he said these were the bravest, most courageous, most resourceful people, and if they could write book stories and tell what they'd encountered, it would be more thrilling than reading any novel about knights in armor. Well, anyway, Haggard was one of these people, and he was connected with a family of Indian fighters. Now, according to one woman's DAR papers, and I called on her as to how she got her documentation, and she couldn't remember. I think she's getting as senile as I am. John Haggard was married to a Miss Mayfield. Now, she didn't descend from him in Mayfield, so she really had lost her paperwork about how she knew they got married. According to a letter left by one of John Haggard's great-grandchildren, he was married to a Miss Gibson. So I don't know who he married, but I kind of think it was Mayfield. Of course, he may have had two wives. Ladies tended to die off pretty fast in that day and time. Because, for instance, I find in the archives where John Haggard and Sutherland Mayfield and John Brown and another Mayfield are building a wolf trap down around Old Hillsboro. And Indians attack them while they're building the wolf trap, and the Mayfield boy is killed, and Haggard and Brown and so forth escape. Also, according to this woman's DAR papers that she's confused about, another Mayfield daughter was married to John Brown. And so it kind of seems reasonable that maybe Haggard was certainly chummy with the Mayfields, because he figures in connection with Mayfields pretty often. Also, he lived at a place called Brown Station, which might have been a stockade built by brother-in-law John Brown. It all seems reasonable. Anyhow, to get to the more interesting part of the story, let's say he married Miss Mayfield. If he did, it's likely that the Indians in this area took a pretty dim view of the family, because Miss Mayfield came from a family of some kind of Indian fighters. I mean, really tough guys, noted Indian fighters. I can't remember her father's name, but her father and brothers were just right out of James Fenimore Cooper. And so she, or whoever the bride was, she and John Haggard had several sons: Samuel, Edmund, John, I don't know, maybe a William, and a little girl, Elizabeth. And they were living out at Brown Station, which is near Old Hillsboro, Tennessee. Anyway, Mrs. Haggard, nay Mayfield or Gibson, as the case may be, was pregnant and going into Nashville with a group of men to try to buy some material to make clothes for the baby. Now, I had heard this from my grandmother Orr, who had heard it from her mama, that being Louisa Durenda Flanagan Jones, who had heard it from her mother-in-law who lived with her, mother-in-law being little Elizabeth Haggard, who grew up to be Elizabeth Haggard Jones. So, I'd heard this story all my life, and then I'll tell you how I documented part of it. Indians attacked the party, and all the men were killed but one, who rolled into somewhere and hid. And he'd broken his leg, so he couldn't have rolled far. But he saw what happened, and he reported that Mrs. Haggard was tortured all night and then killed. Okay, I'd heard this story from time immemorial, and then I had also read in one of the Life of Andrew Jackson books or something that John Haggard was listed as an Indian fatality at around this time. But recently, there was a man named Judge, I believe, Haygood, who wrote a very early history of Tennessee at about the time it was all happening. And about a year or two ago, someone found in an old trunk in Nashville his handwritten notes, including letters from people he'd interviewed and accounts by contemporaries in their own hand. This caused a great excitement and to-do, because it included a lot of stuff that wasn't in his original history book. And so the papers were given to the archives. I bought a complete transcription, a complete, not transcription, they wouldn't transcribe it, but a printout of the papers. So all I got is a Xerox of the papers, this handwritten stuff, so it's very hard to read. And sure enough, I read where John Haggard's wife is going into town and is killed by Indians, and that when her husband and children and neighbors come and find her body, she's been badly mutilated. In fact, she's been split open and the fetus thrown out. So, this confirms the story that little Elizabeth Haggard, who grew up to be Jones, told her daughter-in-law, who told her daughter, who told me. Then I found in a contemporary account in, I believe, Putnam's History of Tennessee, an account of John Haggard's death, mentioning that he was an Indian spy, that he was found killed by Indians, and he was been really overkilled, that they had killed him good. And the writer, this contemporary, said this was a little unusual, that the Indians didn't usually go out of their way that way, but it was assumed that that Mr. Haggard had been on a rampage killing Indians because of the death of his wife. So I gather, like Charlie Bronson in one of his movies, he had struck out and just killed Indians without any consideration of whether they were the guilty parties or even the same tribe. So that took care of him. In the courthouse records in Davidson County, you find where they had a sale and sold John Haggard's goods. And it's interesting to read that they sold his silver shoe buckles, and they sold the silver buttons off his coat, and they sold his wife's petticoats. It says one new and one used, I think. And they sell these various things. And I found another place where they sold his rifle and his flat iron. And it said they kept one basket for the use of the children. There's also something I found in the archives of the history library somewhere that mentions the Haggard children as having been left in great want. The next thing I find out about the Haggard children is I see that one Jesse Jones of Springfield, Tennessee, has apprenticed the three little Haggard boys. They become his apprentices until they're old enough to take care of themselves. Now, this Jesse Jones later married Elizabeth Haggard, and it's really interesting to speculate on how these boys came to be apprenticed. Were they apprenticed because they were in great want and the community had to do something with them, teach the kids trades or do something? And through this arrangement, he met Elizabeth Haggard, Jesse did. She must have been a child, and he must have been, he was obviously a full-grown man. And he just waited for her. He liked her look so well. Or maybe he'd already seen her and made a move to apprentice her brothers because it would give him a chance to keep her around the house, too, sometime. And maybe he was a pedophile. I don't know. And anyway, they were married. And he and his brother Eli had a mill up near Springfield. And my grandmother said in her youth, the area was still known as Jones Mill, some part of town. Polly and I went to Springfield once and looked on some old maps, and we more or less located where the mill must have been. It had to be near water, of course. And there are some records of Jesse up there. Eli, we see where Elizabeth bought Eli's horse, I think, a few little odds and ends. And we found where Jesse and Eli had gone to a sale and bought, quote, a quantity of corn and one small still, unquote. And when I told Mammy about this, she didn't believe it. She said, oh, no, 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 said she. But anyway. Then then Jesse Jones died and left the widow Elizabeth Haggard Jones and her children. And as I mentioned earlier, she had a brother, one of these boys who'd been apprenticed, I believe, who by that time was full grown and on his own and doing very well down there in Maury County. So she moved down and bought the place that we know as Sam's Farm. Mammy told me that Pa, her father, who was little Edmund Jones, drove one of the wagons when they moved down, so they hauled a good deal of paraphernalia. And Mammy had an iron pestle, thing you grind stuff in, that she said was in the wagon that Pa drove. Now, that disappeared when the farm was sold, and I'm so sorry. Incidentally, a little iron pot I have that almost disappeared when we moved this time, sitting in my workroom right now with an African violet in it, belonged to Great-Grandma Jones, and she used to feed the babies in it, heat up their food. I guess if a little rust and iron got off the pot, that was considered good for them, because to give children iron, they used to soak rusty nails in water and then have the children drink the water, which I guess might work. I don't know. Anyway, quite a few of them survived despite these treatments. And I'm trying to remember if there's anything else particularly interesting I should include. You've all heard how Minerva Vincent died as a result of being determined to go to a party when she was broken out with a rash. So she had the black ladies pack her in cold rags in a tub of ice or something, and the breaking out went back in, and she went to the party and immediately died. So I don't know, perhaps she had measles, I don't know what she had, but she enjoyed a good party. Her brother was Uncle Anderson Vincent, whom you've heard me mention, who was in the Confederate Army when he was 16 and was a real hell-raiser all his life. Sam told me that Uncle Anderson once stole his brother-in-law's horse, Thomas Owen's horse, and Thomas went to see his daddy, John Vincent, and told him if he didn't pay for the horse, he was going to have Anderson put in jail no matter what. The darling little house Willie Jones used to live in was Uncle Anderson's house, and I was told that when he came out of the Army and the war was lost, he refused to take the oath of allegiance and got put in jail, and his wife had to sell that property to my great-grandpa Jones to bail Uncle Anderson out. He was a rather lively one. I can't think of anything else right now that you all may want to know. I do know quite a bit about a lot of these people. Some of them weren't very interesting. And if you want to know more, maybe I can tell you, but you better ask fast. Meantime, have real happy birthdays, and you're good children, and I'm very proud of you, and you're a credit to everyone I've mentioned.